The Sound from Calder Mountain, Boraska. The No Sleep Story by C.K. Walker Part 1. The Summer We Arrived, Chapter 1. Grover's Mill. My father used to say that a man without a second chance deserves everything the world gives him after his first one runs out. I was 12 years old the summer he decided he deserved a second chance, and the place he chose to take it was a town called Grover's Mill, which sat at the base of Calder Mountain in a fold of the Appalachian Range that the surrounding counties had mostly forgotten about. He had been offered a position with the county sheriff's department, which was a smaller and less prestigious thing than the federal investigator's job he had resigned from the previous year, but which came with a salary and a house and a county vehicle and a reason to get out of bed in the morning, which was what he said he needed. My mother did not say much about the move. She had the particular quality of endurance that some people develop when they have been living alongside a difficult thing for long enough that enduring has become a kind of expertise. She packed the house with the systematic focus of someone completing a project, and she drove the moving truck, and she set up the new house in Grover's Mill with the same systematic focus, and she arranged the kitchen the way she liked it, and that was that. I was less philosophical about it. I was 12, and I had left behind a school where I knew everyone and a neighborhood where I had been navigating the social geography since the second grade, and I had arrived in a town that had one main street and two churches and a diner and a gas station, and a population of approximately 1,100 people, of whom I knew precisely none. Grover's Mill had one other feature that the real estate agent had not mentioned in her materials, and that my father had not thought to ask about, and that I would not learn the significance of until the night of my first full week there, when I woke at 2 in the morning to a sound that I had never heard before, and that I would spend the next 4 years trying to understand. It came from the mountain. It was a mechanical sound, or close to mechanical, a rhythmic grinding that rose and fell in slow cycles, deep enough that you felt it in your chest as much as you heard it with your ears, with a quality of metal on metal that suggested something very large and very old turning against itself in the dark up on the slope. It lasted approximately 3 minutes, and then it stopped, and the night was ordinary again. Crickets and wind and the distant sound of the county road. I lay in my bed in the dark and listened to the silence after it, and tried to decide whether I had dreamed it. I had not dreamed it. Chapter 2. Danny Croft and the Triple Pine. I met Danny Croft on the third day, which was a Monday in June when the summer was already settled, and the heat came down in the afternoon like something with weight to it. He was at the end of our street with a bicycle that had something wrong with the rear derailleur, and a look on his face that communicated both the seriousness of the derailleur problem and a willingness to be interrupted from addressing it if the interruption was sufficiently interesting. I was sufficiently interesting by virtue of being new, which in a town the size of Grover's Mill made you briefly remarkable the way a new building or a new road made you briefly remarkable. Something to be examined and assessed and incorporated into the existing geography. His name was Danny, and he was 13, and he had been in Grover's Mill his entire life, and he knew every part of it with the proprietary knowledge of someone who has mapped a territory completely and is prepared to be its guide if the conditions are right. He had dark hair and a missing canine tooth on the upper left side from a bicycle incident the previous summer, and he spoke with a directness that I immediately appreciated, the directness of someone who did not see the point in the longer route to information when the shorter one was available. He showed me the town that afternoon, walking his bicycle beside me through the streets, narrating as we went. The diner, which had the best pie in the county and the worst coffee. The library, which was smaller than the diner and had a librarian named Mrs. Galt, who would let you check out anything regardless of the age recommendations on the spine if you looked her in the eye when you asked. The old mill building by the creek, which gave the town its name and which was genuinely old and genuinely a mill, and which Danny had explored comprehensively and declared structurally unreliable but historically interesting. Then he stopped at the edge of town where the road curved toward the mountain trailhead and pointed up the slope. "You see that cluster of pines up there," he said. "The three big ones. We call it the triple pine. There is a platform in the branches, a proper one with planking and a railing. Somebody built it years ago and nobody knows who. Every kid in town has been up there at least once." I looked up the slope at the three pines, which were indeed large and which, at this distance, showed the dark lines of something constructed among their upper branches. "What is the rule?" I asked. Danny looked at me. "What do you mean?" he said. I said, "There is always a rule with places like that. You have to carve your name, or you have to say something, or you have to leave something behind. There is always a rule." Danny looked at me for a moment with the look of someone reassessing an initial classification. "You carve your name," he said, "on the center pine. If you go up to the platform and you do not carve your name, something bad happens to you." I asked what kind of bad thing. He looked at the mountain. He looked at it in the way that people look at things they have decided not to look at and then look at anyway. The way you look at a scar or a closed door or a news headline that you know will be worse than you expect. "You disappear," he said. His voice was flat when he said it, the flatness of a person conveying a fact rather than a theory, and the flatness was what made it serious rather than dramatic. I looked at the triple pine and then I looked at Danny. "Has anyone?" I asked. He said, "2 kids since I have been old enough to know about. And more before that. The town says they ran away or went to live with relatives or had to move for family reasons. The town says a lot of things." He started walking again and I walked beside him, and the triple pine was behind us now and neither of us said anything for a while. Then I asked about the sound from the mountain. Danny stopped walking. Chapter 3. What Danny told me, we sat on the wall outside the library for a long time that afternoon while he told me about it. He told me in the careful and sequential way of someone who has been carrying information and is relieved to share it with someone capable of receiving it properly. He told me about the sound, which he called the grind, which everyone in town called the grind, although most of them did not call it anything when outsiders were present, and which had been a feature of the mountain for as long as anyone in Grover's Mill had been old enough to hear it. He told me it came from somewhere on the upper slope, from the direction of the old mining operations that had driven the town's original settlement a century ago. The mountain had been mined for iron ore starting in the 1880s and continuing through the early 1950s, when the ore ran out and the operations were shut down, and the mine shafts sealed and the processing buildings left to decay. The grind, as far as anyone Danny knew had been able to determine, came from somewhere near the location of the largest of those processing buildings. I asked why nobody went up to look. He looked at me with an expression that was several things at once. "People go up," he said. "Adults, mostly. The county goes up every few years to assess the structural condition of the old mine shafts. Park Service people go up for trail maintenance. Hunters go up. People go up." He stopped, and I said, "And nothing," he said. "They go up and they come back and they say there is nothing up there. Decayed buildings and sealed shafts and second-growth timber and wildlife sign. That is what they say." I waited. "My father went up," Danny said, 2 years ago. He went up alone on a Sunday morning and he came back at dinner time and he did not talk about what he had seen for 3 days. Then he sat me down and he said that there was nothing on that mountain that I needed to concern myself with, and that I was not to go up past the triple pine under any circumstances, and that if I heard the grind in the night, I was to stay in my room. He paused. I asked him what he had seen, Danny said. He said he had not seen anything. He said it exactly the way you say something when what you mean is the opposite. We sat on the library wall and looked at the mountain, which was visible from most points in Grover's Mill, a constant presence at the edge of every view, green, forested, and ordinary looking in the afternoon light, giving away nothing. I told Danny about the sound I had heard on my first night. He nodded. "You will hear it again," he said. "It comes 2 or 3 times a month, always at night, always from up there." He looked at the mountain. "What do you think it is?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I think it is a machine," he said. "I think it is a machine that has been running for a very long time. And I think what it is doing is the thing that nobody in this town will say out loud." I waited. He did not say what the thing was. I did not ask again. Not that day. Chapter 4. Mara Voss. I met Mara Voss 2 weeks later at the library, which was where she spent most of her time during that summer. She was 12, which was the same age as me, and she had been in Grover's Mill for 2 years, having moved there with her mother after her parents' separation. And she had spent those 2 years conducting what she described, without any apparent self-consciousness, as a research project into the town's history. She had notebooks, 3 of them, dense with her handwriting, which was small and precise, the handwriting of someone for whom neatness was not a preference but a requirement. She had photocopies from the county historical archive, local newspaper articles dating back to the 1940s, and a hand-drawn map of the mountain's upper slope, based on a Forest Service survey from 1987 that she had found in the library's local history section, and copied by hand, because the photocopier in the library cost 10 cents a page, and she had a budget of $2. She showed me the notebooks the second time we met, which was the following Tuesday when I went back to the library, and found her at the same table with the same materials spread before her. She showed them to me not because I had asked, but because she had been watching me for a week, she said, and had determined that I was someone who would take the information seriously. And taking the information seriously was, in her view, the minimum qualification for being trusted with it. I sat down, and she told me what she had found. The mountain, she said, had a longer history than the town. The mining company that established Grover's Mill in the 1880s had bought the land rights from a previous owner, a man named Calder, for whom the mountain was named, who had himself acquired it from an estate sale in the 1860s. The estate had been that of a family called Prescott, which had operated the land as a private holding for several generations before the sale. Before the Prescotts, the records became incomplete, as records from that era often did. The significant thing, Mara said, was not the ownership history but the disappearances. She opened the 3rd notebook to a page near the middle. The page was a chronological list, names and dates, going back to the 1890s. Young women mostly, some men, a few children. Spanning 12 decades of Grover's Mill's history, the list ran to 47 names. I looked at the list for a long time. 47, I said. That I could document, she said. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Before 1920, or so, the record keeping was inconsistent, and the town was smaller and people moved around more, so disappearances were easier to attribute to voluntary departure. After the 60s, the county got better at tracking missing persons reports, but the ones from Grover's Mill were consistently closed without resolution. She tapped the page. Consistently, she said. Every one of them. Opened, investigated, closed. No body, no suspect, no explanation. 47 names. I looked at the map of the upper slope. She had marked the locations of the 3 main mine shafts, sealed in 1953, and the processing building that the county records described as partially collapsed. She had also marked, in a different color, several locations that were not on the official map, but that she had identified from older documents. 2 structures that the historical record referred to as dormitories used to house mine workers during the operational years, and 1 structure that was referred to only as the lower building, without further description. "What is the lower building?" I asked. "That," she said, "is what I have not been able to find out. It appears in the records from the 1890s through approximately 1930, and then it stops appearing. No demolition record, no collapse record. It simply stops being mentioned." She looked at the map. "I think it is still up there," she said. Part 2. The Years the Sound Came, Chapter 5. The summer Nadia disappeared. Nadia Croft was 16 when she vanished, which was the August of my first year in Grover's Mill, which made her Danny's older sister, which meant that Danny was the person who came to the library that Tuesday morning with his face the color of old concrete and told Mara and me that Nadia had not come home the night before. She had gone to a party at the old quarry on the south side of town, which was where the older kids went in the summer when the town had nothing else to offer. And she had texted Danny at 11 to say she was getting a ride home with a friend, and that was the last contact anyone had with her. The friend, when the sheriff's office located her the next day, said Nadia had left the quarry alone around midnight, saying she was going to walk home, which was less than a mile. The route between the quarry and the Croft house did not pass the mountain. It did not pass the triple pine. There was no obvious reason for the route to take her anywhere near the upper slope. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. My father was one of the officers assigned to it, which meant I heard things at the dinner table that I was not supposed to hear. Things spoken in the careful, partial way of adults who are aware that there is a child at the table and are trying to balance the competing pressures of a professional conversation and a domestic one. I absorbed these fragments with the particular attention of a 12-year-old who understands that the partial things are the important ones. What I absorbed was no physical evidence at the quarry, no physical evidence on the route between the quarry and the Croft house, no physical evidence anywhere that indicated where Nadia had gone after she left the quarry. One witness, an older man who lived on the road between the quarry and town, who said he had seen a girl walking north on the shoulder of the road at approximately midnight. She had been walking north, which was away from town rather than toward it. She had been walking quickly, he said, and she had been alone. North was the direction of the mountain. Danny did not say much in the weeks after Nadia disappeared. He came to the library sometimes and sat at the table with Mara and me, and looked at her notebooks without reading them. And sometimes he went home after 10 minutes, and sometimes he stayed for hours. He was doing the thing that people do when they are living next to a grief that is too large to approach directly. The thing where you stay in motion and keep your hands occupied and talk about small things and wait for the large thing to become approachable. It did not become approachable. Nadia was not found. The case was closed without resolution, the 48th name on a list that the county did not know it was keeping. Chapter 6. What we found in the archive the following spring, when I was 13 and Mara was also 13, and Danny was 14, and the winter had slowly softened the acute edge of his grief into the more endurable form of its chronic version. The 3 of us went to the county archive in the next town, which was the county seat, and which was 20 miles from Grover's Mill on a road that Mara's mother was willing to drive us on under the pretense of a school history project. The county archive was in the basement of the courthouse, maintained by a woman named Agnes Pickard, who had worked there for 30 years, and who regarded the archive with the proprietary protectiveness of someone who has made the care of something her life's work, and does not intend to let it be carelessly handled. She was not unfriendly, but she had the professional wariness of a keeper of records who has learned that people seeking unusual things in archives frequently have unusual reasons for seeking them. Mara presented our request with the seriousness and precision of someone who had prepared for this meeting. She asked for the historical records of the Grover's Mill mining operations, the original land grants for the Calder Mountain parcel, and any administrative records related to the mine workers' housing facilities from the operational period. Agnes looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I know what you are looking for, and I am going to give it to you, because people your age should know the truth of this place rather than finding it out the way adults in this county find it out, which is by becoming complicit in it." Danny and I looked at each other. Agnes went to the back of the archive and returned with 3 boxes of documents and set them on the reading table. She said, "The Prescott family owned the land before the mining company. They owned it before that. The Calder family, who ran the mine, were cousins of the Prescotts. The mine used the existing infrastructure the Prescotts had built, which they expanded significantly. The county was aware of what that infrastructure was used for. The county has always been aware. The county chose to be aware in the particular way of choosing not to investigate things that keep a town prosperous." She looked at us steadily. "Read what is in those boxes," she said. "All of it. Then decide what you want to do with what you know." We spent 4 hours in the archive. What we read in those 4 hours was the documentary history of something that had been operating in Grover's Mill for over a century, organized by the Prescott family, and continued by the Calder family, and administered by successive iterations of the county's most prominent men. A thing that had produced the prosperity that kept the town alive, and that had been paid for in a currency that the county's official records consistently refused to name. The lower building was not a dormitory. The dormitory records were cover documents for something else. The real records, the ones that had survived in the archive because Agnes Pickard had preserved them, and because nobody sufficiently senior had thought to order their destruction, described a facility built into the lower slope of the mountain that had operated without interruption from the 1890s to the present. The records described its purpose, and its operation and its output. They described, in the careful and bureaucratic language of people who had decided that a sufficiently neutral vocabulary could sanitize anything, what the grind was and what it ground. I am not going to transcribe what those records said. I have read them once, and I do not intend to read them again, and I do not intend to reproduce their language, which was the language of men who had decided that some people were a resource, and that processing resources was the ordinary work of an ordinary business. What I will say is this: the 47 names on Mara's list were not the complete count, not by a significant margin. Chapter 7. The men who ran it, we drove back to Grover's Mill in the afternoon, with the documentary evidence photographed on Mara's disposable camera, which she had brought for exactly this purpose, and with the knowledge of what was on that mountain sitting in the car with us like a 4th passenger, taking up all the available air. Mara's mother drove and did not ask about the school project, which was not like her, and I understood from her silence that she had known, or had known the shape of it if not the specific contents, which was probably true of most of the adults in Grover's Mill who had lived there long enough to learn what questions not to ask. I thought about my father. I thought about the Sunday 2 years ago when he had gone up the mountain and come back at dinner time and not spoken for 3 days. I thought about what he had seen up there that afternoon, and I thought about whether he had reported it, and what had happened when he had, or whether he had not reported it, and what that meant about the version of him I had been living alongside since we moved to Grover's Mill. I thought about what Danny's father had said to Danny after he came back from the mountain. There is nothing up there that you need to concern yourself with, said in exactly the way you say something when you mean the opposite. I thought about the list of names. I thought about Nadia. That night, I could not sleep, and I lay in my bed listening for the grind, which did not come. And I went over and over the question that I did not know how to answer yet, but that I knew would eventually require an answer, whether what we had found in the archive was something that could be addressed through the institutions that were supposed to address it, which were the county and the state and the law, or whether those institutions were themselves part of what we had found. My father was the law. He was one of the men who wore the county's uniform and drove the county's vehicles and investigated what the county assigned him to investigate and closed what the county assigned him to close. 47 names, all closed. I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about my father. Part 3, what we did, Chapter 8. The year we waited 1 year before we did anything. This was Mara's decision, and it was the correct one. And I want to say that clearly because the year of waiting is the part of this account that I am most inclined to defend and most uncertain about simultaneously. The year of waiting meant that more time passed during which whatever was operating on the mountain continued to operate. And the cost of that time is one I have counted and recounted, and cannot arrive at a number, for that is tolerable. But the year of waiting also meant that we were 14 rather than 13, that we had completed the preparation that Mara insisted on, that we had the resources and the documentation and the external contacts that we did not have in the spring of the archive visit. Mara's preparation was the work of someone who understood that the difference between a documented accusation and an undocumented one was the difference between something that could survive the efforts of powerful people to suppress it and something that could not. She organized the archive photographs into a coherent documentary record. She wrote a summary account of the history of the Prescott and Calder operations that any literate adult could follow without prior knowledge of the subject. She identified 3 journalists, 2 at regional papers, and 1 at a national outlet, who had published investigations into institutional corruption, and who had, in her assessment, the professional integrity to handle material of this sensitivity responsibly. She mailed copies of the summary account and the documentary record to all 3 journalists and to the state attorney general's office using envelopes addressed in her mother's handwriting, because she reasoned, correctly, that mail from a 14-year-old would receive less attention than mail from an adult. She kept copies of everything. Danny spent the year the way Danny always spent hard things, which was by staying in motion. He worked after school at the hardware store, and he spent his weekends maintaining the bicycle fleet of every kid in the town who needed it. And he came to the library twice a week and sat with us and did not talk about what we were doing, but was present for all of it. He was, in ways that were not demonstrative and did not call attention to themselves, the most steady of the 3 of us during that year. I spent the year watching my father. I watched him the way you watch someone you love when you are trying to determine whether the version of them you love is the complete version, or whether there is another version that the first one is covering. It was the most painful, sustained attention I have ever given to anything, because the person I was watching was a person I needed to believe in for reasons that went far beyond what was on the mountain. And the evidence I was accumulating was not conclusive in either direction, which is its own particular form of difficulty. He was a good man in the ways that were visible to me. He was kind to my mother and patient with me and honest in the ordinary transactions of daily life. He did his job with the professionalism of someone who took the job seriously. He was, by every measure that I had access to, the father I had always known him to be, but he had been to the mountain. And he had come back, and he had not done anything. I sat with that for a year and did not arrive anywhere satisfying. Chapter 9. The night we went up on the last Saturday of August, when we were all 14 and had been in Grover's Mill for 2 years, and knew the mountain's lower slopes well enough from daylight explorations to navigate them in the dark. We went at midnight, which was late enough that the town was settled and the roads were empty, and the probability of being seen and stopped by someone who knew our parents was as low as it was going to be. Danny led. He knew the trail better than either of us, having spent more time on the lower slope than Mara or me, and he had the particular physical confidence of someone who is comfortable in dark terrain, who moves with enough awareness of his own body to trust its responses to uneven ground without needing to see it clearly. He carried the better of the 2 flashlights. Mara carried the other and her notebook. I carried the camera that her mother had agreed, without asking why, to advance Mara the money to buy, a 35mm point and shoot with 2 rolls of film. We passed the triple pine in the first 20 minutes. Its platform was visible in the moonlight as a darker shape among the branches, and I looked at the 3 trunks as we passed and saw the carvings on the center one, which were numerous enough to cover a section of bark roughly 4 feet across, names and dates going back decades, the names of every child in Grover's Mill who had learned the rule and followed it. I saw Nadia's name. D. Croft had carved it into the bark the summer before she disappeared. The letters were clean and deep, the way letters look when they are carved by someone who intends them to last. Danny did not look at the carving as we passed. He kept his flashlight on the trail ahead and his pace steady. Mara touched my arm briefly, and then we were past the triple pine and moving up into the older, darker forest of the upper slope. The grind started when we were approximately 40 minutes above the triple pine. It came from above and ahead, from somewhere in the dark of the upper slope, where the trees thinned and the terrain changed from trail to open hillside. It was louder than it was from the town, much louder, and up close it had qualities that the town distance had not communicated, a complexity of sound within the grinding that suggested multiple moving parts, and a regularity of rhythm that implied, as Danny had said years ago, a machine. Something designed and built and maintained, operating on a schedule that was not random. We stopped when it started. Danny looked back at us. His face in the diffuse moonlight was the face I had come to know well over 2 years, the face that communicated what it was feeling in the direct and economical way of its owner. It was afraid. He was afraid in the steady and functional way of someone who had decided to be afraid and continue anyway, which is the only useful form fear takes. He turned back to the slope and kept climbing. Chapter 10. The lower building was not on the trail. Nothing on the upper slope was on any trail. We navigated by the moonlight and by Mara's hand-drawn copy of the Forest Service survey, and by the compass bearing she had calculated in advance, moving across terrain that was steep and uneven and covered in the low scrub growth of a hillside that had been logged at some point in the past century and was in the process of becoming forest again. The sound grew louder as we climbed. It had a direction now that we were close enough for directionality to be useful, and the direction was slightly to our right, northeast, rather than due north, which was consistent with the position Mara had marked on the map. We found the perimeter fence first. It was chain link, 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire, and it ran in a curve that suggested a large enclosed area rather than a single building. It was not old. The chain link was galvanized and had not yet begun to rust significantly, which meant it had been installed within the last decade, possibly more recently. This was the detail that I had trouble processing in the moment of seeing it, and that I have returned to many times since. The fence was new. Whatever was behind it was not a relic, not an abandoned facility from the mining era slowly decomposing on the mountain. It was an active operation, enclosed by recently installed infrastructure, maintained by people who were still maintaining it. We moved along the fence line until we found the gate. The gate was padlocked, the padlock heavy and relatively new, and beside the gate was a keypad of the kind used to enter code-operated locks, and the keypad had a small red indicator light that was illuminated, which meant it was powered, which meant there was electricity running to this location on the upper slope of Calder Mountain. I photographed the fence and the gate and the keypad. Mara was writing in her notebook, fast and dense, describing everything she was seeing in the systematic way she described everything. Danny was looking at the illuminated keypad with an expression I did not have a word for. The grind was very loud here. The vibration of it was in the ground under our feet, a low and rhythmic tremor that traveled up through the soles of our shoes and into the bones of our legs. It was a functional sound, entirely industrial, the sound of a mechanism doing what it was built to do, and it was coming from somewhere behind the fence, somewhere in the dark of the enclosed compound. Then the light came on inside the compound. It was a floodlight mounted on a pole, and it illuminated a large area in front of what I could now see was a concrete structure, low and wide, extending further into the hillside than the floodlight reached. The structure was not the mining era ruin described in the county's official documents. It was a building that had been modified and maintained and added to over a long period of time, with sections of different construction materials and different ages visible in the exterior wall. Original stone from the earliest construction, alongside concrete blocks from a later period alongside metal sheeting of more recent installation. And in the light, we saw the men. There were 4 of them. They were moving between the building's entrance and a vehicle, a county truck, loading something into the cargo area. They were not hurrying. They moved with the easy and practiced efficiency of people doing routine work, and they were talking to each other in voices too low to make out words at this distance. I raised the camera. I took the photograph. The flash went off. Chapter 11. Running, I want to be precise about the sequence of events because the sequence matters. The flash went off. There was a pause of approximately 2 seconds during which the 4 men in the compound looked in our direction. Then one of them shouted. Then we ran. Danny went first because he was already facing downhill. Mara went second, tucking the notebook inside her jacket as she moved. I went third, the camera swinging from my wrist on its strap, already rewinding the film from pure reflex. We ran down the slope in the way that you run down an unfamiliar steep hillside in the dark, which is not cleanly. We fell and recovered and fell again, and the scrub grabbed at our legs, and the ground was unreliable under our feet, and behind us we could hear the sounds of pursuit, which were the sounds of adult men who knew this terrain far better than we did. Heavy footsteps and voices and the beam of a powerful flashlight sweeping across the slope behind us. We reached the triple pine. I do not know why I looked up as we passed it. I do not know what I expected to see. What I saw was the platform and the carved trunks, and in the sweep of the pursuing flashlight that caught the upper branches for a fraction of a second before moving on, a shape in the fork of the center pine that I could not identify clearly, and that I have spent years since trying to place into a category of explainable things and have not succeeded. It was the shape of something that had been there for a long time, patient and still and entirely untroubled by the running and the shouting and the light. Then we were past the triple pine and on the lower trail, and the trail was familiar, and our bodies knew it even in the dark, and we ran without falling until we reached the town. We did not stop running until we were inside Mara's house, which was closest to the trailhead, with the door locked behind us and Mara's mother in the kitchen looking at the three of us with an expression that contained several things simultaneously. She said, "Sit down. I will make tea, and then you will tell me everything." Part 4. What came after Chapter 12. Mara's mother, her name was Carol Voss, and she was a practical and honest woman who had moved to Grover's Mill for reasons she had described to Mara as temporary, and which had become less temporary with time, as temporary things in small towns often do. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything we told her with the focused attention of someone cataloging information rather than reacting to it. And when we finished, she sat for a moment with her teacup between her hands. Then she said, "I know, not all of it, but I know the shape of it." She told us what she knew, which was the adult version of what we had found, which was the version that adults in Grover's Mill arrived at over years of living alongside the town's particular silence about certain subjects, the version that was assembled from fragments and implications, and the specific way that certain topics were never discussed, which communicated as clearly as discussion would have. She told us that 3 weeks ago, she had received a phone call from a woman at a regional newspaper who said she had received material in the mail regarding irregularities in the county's administration of missing persons cases originating in Grover's Mill, and who wanted to discuss it. Mara looked at me across the table. Carol said I told her I did not know anything about it, because I did not, at that point, know that Mara had sent the material. She looked at her daughter. Mara said I should have told you. Carol said yes, but what is done is done. The reporter called back yesterday. She says she has been working on it and she wants to bring someone from the state attorney general's office into the conversation. We sat with that. I thought about the men in the compound. I thought about the county truck. I thought about the fact that what had driven us to the archive and then to the mountain had been the question of whether the county's institutions could be used to address what was on the mountain, or whether those institutions were themselves part of it. I thought about my father. "I have to tell someone," I said. Carol looked at me. "Someone outside the county," I said. She nodded. Chapter 13. My father, I told him the following morning. I told him everything, beginning with the sound I had heard on the first night, and ending with the photograph I had taken, and the men in the compound and the county truck. I told him in the same sequential and precise way that I had learned from Mara, leaving nothing out, watching his face as I spoke. He listened without interrupting. His face did the thing that a face does when it is receiving information that it already contains some version of, the thing where the features do not register surprise, because the surprise has been absorbed in advance. And what remains is something more complicated, the particular expression of a person being given explicit form for something they have been carrying in implicit form for a long time. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "A year," I said, "since the archive." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were the eyes of a man who has made a decision. He said, "I went to the mountain the year we arrived. I was assigned to do a routine inspection of the mine shaft seals, which is a standard periodic task. I saw the fence. I saw the building. I heard the sound up close. I reported what I had seen to the department." He stopped. "The department told me the facility was a private mineral processing operation operating under a county variance permit, and that it was not within the scope of my assignment. They told me this clearly and immediately, which meant that someone senior had anticipated the report and had a prepared response. I had been on the job for 6 months. I did not yet understand what I was understanding." He looked at me. I understand it now, he said. I have understood it for some time. I have been trying to determine what to do with that understanding in a way that protects this family and does something useful with what I know. Those two objectives have been difficult to reconcile. I told him about the journalist and the Attorney General's office. Something moved across his face. He said, "That is the right path. The department cannot investigate itself. The county cannot investigate itself. The state can if the information gets to the right people within it." He stood up. "I need to make some calls," he said. "People I know from my time in the federal service, people who are outside this county's reach. Will you give me the journalist's name?" I gave him the name. He nodded. Then he said, "I want you to know something. The night I went to the mountain and came back and did not speak for 3 days, I was not deciding whether to report it. I was trying to understand what I had found and whether I could protect you and your mother if I reported it, and I was afraid that I could not. I have been afraid of that ever since. I am still afraid of it." He looked at me with the look of a man who needs his child to understand something true about him. "I am your father," he said. "Before anything else. I want you to know that." I did know that. I had known it the whole year I had been watching him, and I had known it and been unable to let it be enough, and I had been wrong about that. It was enough. It did not cover everything, but it was enough. Chapter 14. The investigation, the state investigation, took 7 months. It was conducted by a team from the Attorney General's office that operated entirely outside the county's administrative structure, which meant that the people who ran what was on the mountain were not informed of the investigation's scope until it was too late for the information to be useful to them. My father contributed everything he knew, which turned out to be more than I had realized, because the 1.5 years he had spent understanding his situation had not been passive. He had been documenting. He had names and dates and the specific knowledge of a law enforcement professional who understood exactly what documentation would and would not survive a legal process. The journalist published her piece 6 weeks into the investigation, which was coordinated with the Attorney General's office to maximize the effect of simultaneous legal and public pressure. The piece ran in the regional paper and was picked up within 48 hours by national outlets, which meant that the story became too large and too visible for the county's senior administration to manage in the ways they had managed things before. The arrests began on a Tuesday morning in March. There were 11 of them, spanning county administration, the sheriff's department, and 2 prominent local families whose involvement with the facility went back 3 generations. The facility itself was shut down and sealed and placed under federal oversight pending the criminal proceedings. The grind did not come on the night the facility was shut down. It did not come the following night or the one after that. In the weeks and months that followed, as the town absorbed what had been revealed, and the proceedings moved through their slow institutional stages, the mountain was quiet. The sound did not come again. I have spent a long time thinking about what it was. The documentary record established clearly that it was a machine, a processing apparatus that had been installed in the 1890s and modified and maintained continuously since. It was not a supernatural thing. It was an industrial one, built and operated by men who had decided that what it did was a sustainable business model, and that the cost of running it was someone else's cost to pay. But I have thought, in the years since, about the triple pine, about the shape I had seen in its branches on the night we ran down the mountain, about the rule that said you had to carve your name or disappear, and about the fact that Nadia had carved her name and disappeared anyway, and about what that meant about the rule and who had invented it and why. I have thought about this, and I have not arrived at a conclusion. Chapter 15. The names the investigation identified and recovered 14 people who were still alive when the facility was shut down. 14, from a list that the documentary evidence extended to well over 100 names across a century of operation. 14. I will not describe what the investigators found inside the facility. I will not describe the condition of the 14 people who were recovered, or the nature of the evidence that established what the facility had been doing. I will say only that the photographs and the documents from the investigation confirmed everything that Mara had understood from the county archive, and that Danny had known, without language for it, from the moment his sister walked north on the road toward the mountain. Nadia Croft was not among the 14. Danny was at the library the afternoon we got this information, which was the Thursday of the second week of the investigation, and the library was where the three of us had gone when news came that required being received somewhere. He was at the table when Mara and I arrived, and he looked at our faces when we came through the door, and he understood from our faces what we were going to tell him before we told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said she carved her name. Yes, I said. He looked at the table. That was the rule, he said. If you carve your name, nothing bad happens to you. That was the rule. Neither of us said anything. Danny looked up. They made the rule, he said. The people who ran the facility. They made the rule so that children in this town would believe it, and so that when something bad happened anyway, the town would say it was because of the rule, because the person had violated the rule somehow, or not carved deeply enough, or done something wrong. So that the town would look at the rule instead of the facility. He said this quietly and without inflection, and it was the most precise thing I have heard anyone say about any of it in the years since. He was right. The rule had served the facility by giving the town a framework for explaining disappearances that kept the explanation inside the folklore and away from the facility. A child disappeared, and the town said they had not followed the rule correctly. A teenager vanished, and the town said the mountain had taken her. The mythology of the triple pine and the grind and the mountain's appetite was the cover story that the facility's operators had cultivated over generations, and it had worked. And it had worked precisely because it was rooted in something real, which was that children in that town did disappear, and that the mountain was the direction they went when they disappeared. The mythology was not the cause, but it wore the face of the cause, and wearing the face was enough. Part 5, afterward Chapter 16. Grover's Mill. After I left Grover's Mill at 18, the summer after I graduated from the county high school, and I drove away in the morning with everything I was taking in the back seat of a car my father had co-signed the loan for. My mother stood on the porch and waved, and my father stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders. He had resigned from the sheriff's department in the third week of the investigation, before the arrests, which had required a particular kind of professional courage given the uncertainty of what came next. The federal government hired him 6 months later, which was the job that the resignation had made possible, the investigation having established his integrity in a way that his record from before Grover's Mill could not have established it on its own. He commuted. We stayed in the house in Grover's Mill for 2 more years while the proceedings played out, and then we moved to the city where his office was. But the Grover's Mill house was the house my parents kept, the one they went back to on weekends and holidays, and the summers that I came home from college. It was a good town in many ways, even after everything. The people who had not been complicit, which was most of the people, did what communities do after a public wound. They absorbed the knowledge of it, slowly and imperfectly, and they continued. The triple pine was still there. Kids still went up and carved their names. The rule was still the rule. observed by children who were now told its history and who observed it anyway, because that is what children do with rules that have the shape of legend. They follow them even when they know the legend was a construction, because the act of following a rule in a place that requires reverence is its own thing, separate from the reasons the rule was invented. The sound did not return. Chapter 17. Danny and Mara. Danny Croft stayed in Grover's Mill. He went to the community college in the county seat and studied engineering, and came back and started a repair business that grew into a small manufacturing operation that employed, within 5 years, 14 people from the area. He was, as he had always been, someone who kept his hands occupied and stayed in motion, and addressed the things in front of him with the focused and unpretentious competence that had always been his most distinctive quality. He was also, in the years after the investigation, one of the people who organized the memorial service for the people who had not been recovered, which was held every year on the slope below the Triple Pine, and which was attended by the families of the missing and by people from Grover's Mill and by people from the county who had driven to be there and by. In the second year, a small group of people from outside the region who had read the journalist's account and who came because they felt the obligation to be present for something that had happened in their country and that they wanted to acknowledge in person. Nadia's name was at the center of the memorial stone that Danny commissioned, and that was installed at the base of the Triple Pine in the 3rd year after the investigation. The stone listed all the names that the investigation had established, the confirmed ones, and it listed them in alphabetical order without dates, because the dates were not always known, and the absence of dates communicated something that dates would have softened, which was the total of the thing, all of it together, all of those names, not parceled out across a century, but present simultaneously. Mara left Grover's Mill for college and did not come back to live there. She studied law and then journalism, and she wrote, in her early career, a series of pieces about other towns in other parts of the country where similar things had operated in similar ways, hidden in similar mythologies, administered by similar networks of men who had decided that the cost of their prosperity was someone else's cost. She wrote these pieces with the same precision and the same relentlessness that she had brought to her notebooks in the Grover's Mill library, and they had the same effect as the precision and relentlessness always had, which was that the things she wrote about could not be ignored afterward in the way they had been ignored before. I think of her work as the continuation of the archive. Agnes Pickard preserved the record of what was hidden. Mara continued the work of making hidden things visible. The line between those two tasks is a short one. Chapter 18. What the mountain holds. I am writing this because the story is true, and because the truest stories are the ones that are hardest to tell in the sequential and dispassionate way that testimony requires. And the hardest part of telling this one is not the events on the mountain, or in the archive, or in the compound. Those parts are factual and can be conveyed factually. The hard part is the part that happens to a person when they grow up in a place that has a secret, and the secret is very large, and the growing up involves learning, gradually and through specific stages, both the secret and the fact of having grown up alongside it without knowing. It changes the way you look at places. I am 41 years old, and I have lived in 4 cities since Grover's Mill, and I have walked through many ordinary towns and ordinary landscapes, and in each one I notice things that I would not have noticed if I had not grown up where I grew up. I notice the particular quality of silence around certain subjects in small communities. I notice the way certain buildings are described in official records and what the descriptions do not contain. I notice the sound that comes from directions that nobody in the community discusses. I notice the names that appear on lists of the missing and what the records say about the investigations. I notice the mythologies, the legends that explain disappearances in terms that keep the explanation away from the actual cause. The rules that tell children what to do and what not to do, and that are enforced by consequences whose real origin is never examined. I notice these things because I learned to notice them in Grover's Mill, where the mythology of the triple pine and the grind and the mountain's hunger served the facility for over a century, and where 3 14-year-olds with a disposable camera and 3 notebooks and access to a county archive contributed to ending it. The mountain is still there. The facility is gone, the building demolished under federal order and the site remediated and documented and closed. The mine shafts are still sealed. The slope is covered in second-growth timber and trail markers, and the ordinary quiet of a hillside returning to forest. The triple pine is still there. The carvings on the center trunk go back decades, generations of names. If you stand at the base of the tree and look up at the platform in the branches, you are looking at the place where the children of Grover's Mill went to perform an act that they understood as protective. And that was invented by people with different intentions. And that was reclaimed by those children in the act of performing it, in the way that any ritual whose original intention has been corrupted can be reclaimed by the people who perform it with genuine intention. I carved my name the summer I arrived. I was 12 and I had been in the town for 3 weeks, and Danny had told me the rule, and I had gone up alone on a Sunday afternoon and carved my initials into the bark below Nadia's name, which I did not yet know was Nadia's name. The carving is still there. I know because I have been back twice. I have stood at the base of the triple pine and looked at my own initials in the bark, and at the names above and below them, and at the way the bark has grown slowly around the carvings over the years, the tree absorbing the marks the way it absorbs everything, gradually and without judgment, incorporating them into its own slow growth. The mountain holds what it holds. Some of it can be recovered and named, some of it cannot. The work is to keep going back, to keep looking, to keep the list and add to it, and refuse to accept the closed case as the complete one. That work does not end. It only passes to the next person who is willing to do it. The end.